I was sitting at the Evangelical Theological Society conference in 2023. The keynote speaker for ETS that year was Abigail Favale, who is a Christian philosopher who teaches at the University of Notre Dame, which also happens to be my alma mater. It's not super relevant to this, but she was giving a very good talk on the issue of transgenderism and a particular kind of shift amongst transgender theorists, advocates, and activists that was occurring that seemed to be a fairly significant shift away from previous theories of gender. Okay. And it struck me that while this shift was in one sense, and this just to say it straight out, it was a shift away from the idea of gender being a purely social construct to gender having something like an actual essence to it, an essentialist view of gender amongst transgender advocates, right? That gender is something real in the world, that it's not just something we create as an act of the mind or the will. So as I was sitting there, I was like, wow, this is really good. But then it started to strike me there were still other things that one would need to address from a Christian or biblical worldview that are sort of endemic in the culture. If we really wanted to attack the roots of what has given rise to transgender ideology and activism, right? Then there's a couple other things that are just sort of embedded in what, like Charles Taylor called the social imaginary of American cultural life that still need to be redressed. And there are intellectual challenges out there, philosophical challenges that we as Christians still have to tackle. And if we don't, so there's intellectual work to be done here. And if we don't, it shouldn't surprise us in the future not to see not just a continuation of transgenderism, but even other kind of more aberrant and weird and strange and incoherent kinds of theories, and then the sort of activism in the political and legal realm that sort of happens because of those theories.
Yeah. Yeah. And while we're kind of in the more, narrow scope of Favale's work, at least, as you kind of witnessed it, what do you want to talk a little bit more about that sort of paradox and, just why that's relevant to the modern conversation? Cause she ties a lot of modern transgender theory and just kind of broader ideology to feminism.
Right.
But obviously there's some conflict there.
And I was working off of her talk, which she was kind enough to share with me. She sent me her notes via email when I asked that I wanted to write an article. She has a book out now. The talk eventually became a book, and the title of the book is in the article somewhere. I can't find it right now, but we'll link to it. But the paradox that Favale was pointing out that's occurring within gender theory or gender identity theory, GET, was that older views, not that old, but we're talking about like views that maybe start with feminist philosophers like Simone de Beauvoir, and then kind of culminate in the work of Judith Butler, are social construct theories of gender, right? That there's not really a biological given in the world that we can know. Rather, what we do is we construct identities that we then apply to phenomena in the world, right? Some of the phenomena in the world that we experience are things that we call men and women, right? What they actually are, and this, I try not to get too down into the weeds of going all the way back to like Kant and everything. We will get there, but basically what it is we cannot really know the what Kant called the noumena, right? The thing behind the phenomena of our experience. So we have sense experiences of the world, the phenomenal world. Okay. But what the mind, what's happening is what Kant did or said or argued was that the mind sort of constructs the phenomena of our sense experiences. Okay, so we kind of start with that sort of Kantian view of the mind constructing the phenomena of our sense experiences, and this, of course, was Kant's answer to Hume's skepticism about the external world, right? And so downstream from that is something like social construct theory. So Kant would say, or would have argued, that reason constructs this phenomena. But for Kant, this is very basic sort of construction of the phenomenal world. The mind is active in imposing structure on the phenomena. So that could be very basic things like space, number, quantity, causality, which was a big one for him because he was trying to answer Hume's skepticism about cause and effect. But for Kant, this is sort of, even though it's subjective, the mind doing this, it's universal, right? It's universal to all people. Every mind does this, constructs the world in this particular sort of way. So we would have commonality amongst different minds, right? But over time, there are critiques then of Kant's idea that reason is universal and operates in this universal and formal way, right? So by the time you get to Nietzsche, this sort of idea of reason is itself downstream from the acts of the individual will, right? So what is more primary is the human will, and the will is actually constructing a reality that is sort of attuned with more basic desires, motivations, wants, drives, and so on and so forth, right? So basically what this is doing is it's getting to the idea that we construct the realities that we kind of want or desire to have. But of course, we're not just individual minds, we are many minds living together, right? So there's a construction of a social reality that we all sort of live in. Again, we don't know what actual reality is, but we are all these individual minds with desires, needs, wants, drives, and we're willfully sort of constructing through language the worlds that we want to sort of live in. Okay. And when you get to de Beauvoir and then Butler, one of the phenomena that in the world is sex or gender, right? And for these feminist theorists, these have been, there's nothing like a woman that is just a given in the world, right? That exists outside of the operation of the mind, imposing things onto this otherwise unknown reality. And this so it applies not just to very basic concepts like space and quantity and so on, but it applies to human beings as well now. All right. So human beings themselves are socially conditioned and conditioning types of things. Everything is a result of a social process. Okay. Now, a lot of this theoretical development was done prior to these feminist thinkers by Frankfurt School philosophers, Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, and so on. who developed this idea that everything was a again conditioned by the mind, right, over time, and that the mind itself had been conditioned. So human thinking has been conditioned over time in such a way that it becomes very difficult to even say that we think similarly to maybe the way people thought, in biblical times, right? Because everything has been continually conditioned to include the mind that is doing the conditioning. All right. So, I mean, for someone like Butler, then, but to talk about biological givens, right, is itself sort of like a fool's errand, right? Really, what we're doing is we're constantly socially constructing um, what we call women or what we call men. But these things can be changed, right? And what you get into then is a kind of competition amongst socially constructing minds to see who comes up with the more powerful or the more the more influential sort of fiction, social fiction that we then apply to our the way we discourse about human beings. So that I said a lot there, but the main ideas would be that for these these social construct theorists, there's no fixed reality, right? Everything sort of gets whittled down to or reduced down to the will of the individual mind and words and how we use words. Okay, so there's nothing like a nature, a male or a female nature, or an essence or a form that is out there, that is external to us, that we are trying to sort of grasp or understand, that we can discover things about. We're creating these realities, and they're mainly linguistic realities. And the reason we can so that we can create and recreate these identities over time in accordance with basically how we feel about it, right? What we sort of desire. So the whole thing there becomes a very just an inherently political project, because whoever sort of can dominate, I guess, the conversation about what gender is, basically sort of gets to say what gender is, right? Which was sort of Nietzsche's point. So now that was the earlier view, that gender is socially constructed all the way down, right? There's nothing there to actually talk about or to discover, nothing extramental in that sense. But what Violet was pointing out in her talk was transgender advocates and theorists are now sort of returning to a more essentialist or realist view of gender, that gender is not just purely constructed as an act of the mind, but instead that there is something, gender, it's real, it's reified, to use that kind of language, it's in the world, and that one has a gender, a male or a female gender. And the paradox here is that for these gender essentialists, the problem is no longer one of trying to change the narrative about socially constructed identities. The problem is that one has literally the wrong body. Okay, so one actually has a deep sense that gender is real, that I am a male, but let's just say, for sake of argument, I don't have a male body, right? So for these newer folks, or the newer, transgender folks, the problem is their deep experience of their actual gender doesn't match up with the body that they have. So something then has to be done to sort of fix that problem. So that's the paradox. It's not the socially constructed view of gender, where it's all sort of will and words. You can reduce it down to will and words. There's a sort of fiction that we're creating. And then it's like, whose fiction about gender is going to win out? Versus gender's real. There is real sort of maleness and femaleness in the world, but we have people who have the wrong bodies. And then what are we going to do about this problem of somebody, to use the old phrase, being trapped in the wrong body?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's, that's super helpful because, on one side, it shows that there has been a shift in that, and the point you kind of make in the article is that in a lot of ways for the average person, it's not a livable view really at the end of the day to hold those things as, like you said, the competing narratives. Like it's a much more difficult ideology to live out. The other piece, like why that distinction is helpful, is because it shows that, most people are not operating on that level of, philosophy and, history of how we define reality. It's a very, grounded experience of life that, there is a social influence piece to it for a lot of people that say somebody draws the conclusion that they're trapped in the wrong body, but it highlights that same kind of disconnect between the sort of abstract, philosophy of it and the grounded, reality that people are identifying for themselves, right?
Social constructivism is a very difficult philosophy to live by, because we tend to just pre-theoretically, we live in a world where we think we know things, basic things, and that we have not constructed these things through a social or historical process. And one of those things that we run into every day that seems like a given of nature is that there are two kinds of persons, right? I mean, you call them male or female, you can call them X and Y, you can call them, Mutt and Jeff, whatever. I mean, any language, Mann und Frau, but, or species A and species B, but it's just, we don't really experience these things as socially constructed identities. We do take them at face value as biological givens or facts, right? So it takes a lot of activism. It takes a lot of aggressive, which we have seen. I mean, this is what we've seen over the last 5 years. It takes a lot of aggressive propagandizing to convince people that these things, these biological facts, are mental constructs, right? That they're basically like useful fictions, but that we can tell a different story, and then once that story gets old, everything will sort of align, not to any reality, but to this story, right? And that's what's been attempted. And again, it's inherently political, because it's about society and it's about a social narrative, right? That has to become predominant. And then what happens is, if you can get that narrative to become the dominant narrative, then you can tailor your laws and your governance to fit that new narrative, right? And and one of the reasons it can be compelling to some extent is because there are some things that are social realities, right? That we do create and impose on the world. There's 2 books that have very similar titles. One is by Peter Berger, the sociologist, called The Social Construction of Reality, the Social Construct of Reality, where he talks about this. He talks about how we create certain realities, right, that don't exist in nature. The other one is John Searle's book called The Construction of Social Reality, right? I mean, take money, for instance. Money doesn't exist as a given in nature. I mean, let's just think in terms of old-fashioned paper or coin money. It's like a dollar bill is a piece of paper, but we invest it with a certain value and it turns into money, right? That is a kind of socially constructed reality. Dollar bills used to have value. They don't have so much anymore, but you get the picture. Or the coins, coins or whatever. So there are things that we sort of impose on natural objects and we treat them as if they have certain value and stuff. We talk about them in certain ways that they're not, right? Physically necessarily that way. There are other kinds of socially constructed realities that are around gender. I mean, blue for boys, pink for girls, whatever. Even maybe clothing, dresses for girls and pants for boys. I mean, you could imagine a world where that was just switched around and nobody thought anything about it, right? Well, with clothing, it might relate to the biological given of how the body is shaped, of course. But I mean, there were kilts, in Scotland that, whatever. Okay. So we start to think, well, maybe, there are some things that we do seem to just create because of culture, history, historical period and time and everything. But, to go too far and think that everything is sort of so socially constructed all the way down, there are no givens of nature, right? That's where I think, you're not to try and convince, you have to use the heavy-handed tactics that we've seen play out over the last several years to the point of, let's say it, to the point of killing people if they disagree, right? That, so that seems to be from a bridge too far. So again, what Favale was pointing out in the talk and was in the book, now some transgender activists, theorists, transgender people are saying, well, okay, it's not that these things are totally socially constructed and everything's just sort of like linguistic fiction. Okay, there is something, a maleness, or femaleness. And this is just for sake, we won't make a short out of this, but, I feel like a woman, but this body's just obviously wrong. But what is primary is that deeper internal sense that I have. There is femaleness, and that's what I really am. So what am I going to do about this wrong body that I seem to be inhabiting? And that seems to be where at least some people are going now, which would return us to something like essences.